Good evening. I am Sat Jali. I'm the Executive Director of the Media Education Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you to this very special event honoring Dr. Jean Kilbourne and the incredible 40-year legacy of the Killing Us Softly films that have examined the image of women in advertising. Actually, the Media Education Foundation's relationship with Jean goes back to before we were even formed in 1991. I remember writing to Jean in 1990 when I was on leave in Vancouver to ask whether her distributor at the time might be interested in also distributing Dreamworlds, the video I just produced on images of women in music video. Thank goodness they said no. Otherwise, MEF might not have existed now. By this time, the early 1990s, when I first got in touch with Jean, Jean and Killing Us Softly were already legendary. And the screening of the film at universities was a major event. We forget how recent it's been that video has become so freely available. And that Killing Us Softly was not only a pioneering work for its content, but also for its form as well. The only other film that actually existed at that time dealing with related content was John Berger's film, Ways of Seeing. That is very, very good company to be in. I remember in 1987 teaching a large lecture class on advertising at UMass and ordering a 35mm print of the film of Still Killing Us Softly. Remember those days? Film, when it actually was film. I had to arrange for a projectionist to come to my class to be able to show the film. When word of it got out, people from everywhere in the university were trying to get into the room. It's the only time in my career where I have had an overflow audience for one of my classes. And it showed me the power of film and video and the importance of talking about vital issues in a way that non-specialists, like students, can engage with. And it got me to think about my own pedagogical activities and about developing video materials for my own classes, which led ultimately to the creation of the Media Education Foundation. We have to remember back to that time, if we remember back to the 1970s, regarding the content also. Not only was the form that Jean was using groundbreaking, but the content was as well. While feminist scholars and activists had always stressed the importance of representation, it had not yet achieved the central status that it would subsequently. And that is down to Jean's work. I want to be very clear that although we, the Media Education Foundation, made the last two Killing Us Softly films, in fact, I directed them. In fact, I forgot, I've mentioned, Killing Us Softly 3 was shot in this very room. Jean was, I think, over there somewhere and giving the presentation, so it's a nice, it's coming back in a nice circle. And although we made the films, I want to be absolutely clear that the central core of those films is Jean's original work and analysis. Well, I often regard, when it comes to Jean's work, I often think of MEF as its publisher. I mean, we helped, get it into the right form and out, but the intellectual center was Jean's contribution. In fact, in some ways, the films are the most straightforward work we ever did because Jean did all the hard work, coming up with the structure and the content and going from one thing to another. But we'll take credit nonetheless. But the films have been Jean's original creations. And I think it's really important to stress that. In fact, the success of the films actually helped, I think, create a whole new field of scholarly research, the study of images of gender and sexuality. Jean's work has not only been life-transforming for the millions of college students who have seen the films and how to engage the issues in a serious way, but it's also been an inspiration for a generation of scholars and researchers as they thought about their own work in very, very different ways. And I just want to stress that the films have had a fundamental role to play in the establishment of a field of study and research. After MEF was founded, I got back in touch with Jean. after her distributor turned us down, I have to come up with other ways of distribution, and so I set up MEF as one way of doing that. So after MEF was founded, I got back in touch with Jean, and she participated in a couple of films, one in 1992 on tobacco advertising, Pack of Lies, and a few years later in 1995, we did another film with her called Slim Hopes on the media's obsession with thinness. She also introduced our film with George Gerbner, the late George Gerbner, The Killing Screens. So when we started work on Killing Us Softly 3, as I said, filmed in this room, we already had established a very solid and trusting relationship that has continued ever since. I also want to stress how important Jean's films have been to the rest of MEF's work. Producing films in a wide variety of fields and on a range of subjects is very difficult, just from a pragmatic and financial perspective. And the success of Killing Us Softly, as well as Jackson Katz's Tough Guys, has allowed us to work on films and in areas that would not have been possible otherwise. So everyone who has worked with MEF owes a huge thank you to Jean. That's why it's so gratifying to honor her in this way.
Thank you so much. This is really overwhelming. It's kind of like being at my own memorial service. My life flashing before my eyes. Or maybe it's sort of like a wedding, only with no prospect of divorce. And how about that hairstyle in the 80s, right? I mean, my friends should have done an intervention, really. They should have said, we've made an appointment for you with a hairdresser, but anyway, they didn't. I'm extremely grateful to the program for this study of women and gender at Smith, especially Carrie Baker and Lorraine Hedger, and to Safe Passage for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you. And I'm so grateful to the Media Education Foundation for this event and for now almost 30 years of really fruitful and exciting collaboration. It's been... I want to give special thanks to Kendra Hodgson for putting this event together, to Jason Young for putting these clips together, which was quite an incredible job, to Alex Peterson for the slideshow, the initial slideshow, and to Jeremy Earp, Loretta Alper, Emily Kipe, and Paige Hendry Bodner, David Mello, and Mitch Gaslin, and also to the current interns, Jenny and Maria. The Media Education Foundation does extraordinary work, and I'm so deeply honored to be affiliated with it and to have been affiliated for so long. And of course, very deep gratitude to Sut Jolly. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be friends and colleagues all these years. I admire so much your brilliance and your passionate commitment to social justice. Thank you so much to the panelists who've traveled some distance to be here and who will be introduced to you soon. I am deeply honored by your friendship and by your presence. I quickly want to acknowledge some people in the audience in no particular order, so just wave. I can't really see you, but first, Leanne Brandon. Where are you, Leanne? There's Leanne, who's Professor Emerita at the College of Education at UMass, a pioneering feminist filmmaker, co-founder of New Day Films, the first female feminist film cooperative, and one of my best friends for over 50 years. Kevin McRae, wherever Kevin is, Kevin has been my friend and my lecture agent for 32 years. We figured that out earlier. Does a fabulous job and also represents some of other people here. Nina Hunteman, who did my first website and who was managed it brilliantly for quite some time and has gone on for a great career herself with media studies and media literacy. Tom Gardner, professor at Westfield University, who's helped me in very many ways and who was instrumental in arranging my honorary doctorate from Westfield several years ago. Is Kat Gordon here? She was going to be. Oh, yes, great. So Kat Gordon, an enlightened advertiser. Maybe that deserves a round of applause. Kat is the co-founder of the 3% movement, which began referring to the fact that only 3% of creative directors at advertising agencies are female, and she's doing groundbreaking work. Kate Price, who's doing very groundbreaking work on child sexual abuse and trafficking, and Rob Oken and David Adams are two feminist men who've been working for decades to end violence against women and to challenge toxic masculinity. And I want to introduce you to the greatest blessing of my life, my daughter, Claudia Kilborn Lux, who is here from Austin, Texas. Claudia is a writer, a social worker, and of course, a feminist activist. When she was about 5 years old, I introduced her to the father of one of my best friends. The father was a surgeon, and I said, Claudia, this is Dr. Emerson. And she looked at him in amazement and said, a man doctor? So, the road here has not been a bright straight highway by a long shot. It's rather been a very crooked path with a whole lot of detours and seemingly random blind alleys. I grew up in a world, I'm going to bring you back to when I first started, don't worry, I'm not going to do the whole thing, but I'm going to but the world in which this all began, I grew up in a world in which there were no female police officers or firefighters or bus drivers, and only a tiny number of lawyers, doctors, businesswomen, politicians. All the women's magazines were published and edited by men. Not only was abortion illegal, most forms of birth control were illegal, and we seem to be going back in that direction now. At Wellesley College, where I went, we had to wear skirts to our seated dinners, and we had a curfew, and I'm sure this was true at Smith in those days as well. Boys were allowed in our rooms only for 2 hours, every Sunday afternoon. We had to keep the doors open and always have 3 feet on the floor. Well, of course, these policies meant that no Wellesley girl ever had sex, ever. And to this day, some of us can only do it with 3 feet on the floor. After I graduated from Wellesley, I had to go to secretarial school to get a job. Opportunities for women were very limited. I was a secretary, I was a waitress. Some brief forays into modeling were seductive but also soul-destroying, but they played a big role in my lifelong interest in the power of the image. I had a series of mindless jobs, and one of them was placing ads into a magazine, and one of these ads changed my life. It was really kind of a typical ad. Insulting to women, demeaning, but somehow, at that moment, it crystallized so many of my experiences. The sexist slights, the terrible jobs, the sexual harassment, the catcalls, the objectification. And I thought, this is atrocious, and it is not trivial. So I took it home and I began collecting ads and putting them on my refrigerator with magnets, and gradually seeing patterns and themes. And a few years later, I did the same with alcohol and tobacco ads. My involvement in the anti-war movement and then the women's movement led me to become a teacher. My slide presentations were effective with my students, and I was invited to speak to larger groups. I had a problem, though, a terror of public speaking, to the extent that when I went to that first big lecture at Concord Academy in 1976, I seriously considered driving off the road. Now, not to kill myself, but just to be incapacitated. And I also thought about phoning in a bomb scare, because in those days, that didn't land you in federal prison. I mean, that just would have cleared the auditorium. But I had something I really wanted to say, something I was passionate about. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, you gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. You must do the thing you think you cannot do. And so I did it, even though I had to stand behind a podium because my knees were shaking so much. In fact, in the early days, a little tip for anyone afraid of public speaking, I put Vaseline on my teeth because my mouth would get so dry I literally couldn't speak. So that's how frightened I was. The first time I was on national television was the Today Show. I had a couple of days' notice. I was a wreck. And my oldest brother said to me, "Relax, Jean. The worst that can happen is you'll disgrace yourself in front of 20 million people." So, having 3 brothers has left me with lifelong compassion for men and also the ability to be a wise ass. Several people told me that I should get an agent, so I researched lecture agencies, and I decided on one that was conveniently located in Boston. And one hot July day in 1977, I called, and I said to the agent who answered, "I have a slideshow on the image of women in advertising, and I thought maybe you'd like to represent me." And he said, "No, I don't think so. We don't really do that kind of thing." I don't know what that kind of thing was, but anyway, we don't do that kind of thing. So I hung up. I didn't have a lot of self-confidence in those days, and I thought, well, it probably was a stupid idea, and I should do something else and put the slideshow on a shelf or something. But I did something very uncharacteristic for me at that time. I called him back, and I said, "You should meet me, and let me come in and just do the presentation." And he said, oh, okay, all right. So I came in and I did the presentation for all the agents, and they decided they would take a chance on me. And a year later, I was their most heavily booked lecturer. And it's still, I think about that a lot because I almost didn't call back. I really almost didn't. And I think, things could have taken a different turn had I not. I was very alone in the beginning. It was hard to convince people that this was an issue. Many people thought women shouldn't speak in public, let alone about sexism and issues like that. And even other feminists thought that advertising was a trivial issue. They would say things like, we can't deal with images like that. We have serious issues like violence. To which I would say, this is related. These images are related. This is part of the cause of all of this violence. Now, of course, there are so many people doing such good work on these issues, such as everyone on this panel, everyone at MEF, Smith, and Safe Passage. And there are young people here tonight, so many, each one of whom has something important to say. So don't be silenced, say it, we need to hear it, and always, always call back. Thank you so much for being here. So now it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Susan J. Douglas, who will introduce the panelists. And I'm going to invite the panelists all to come up now while I introduce Susan. Susan J. Douglas is the Catherine Nefi Kellogg Professor and Arthur F. Thurnow, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, Professor of Communication Studies and former department chair at the University of Michigan. Her new book, In Our Prime, How Older Women Are Reinventing the Road Ahead, is forthcoming in March 2020 from Norton, and I can't wait to read it. Susan's a fabulous writer and thinker, and this is going to be a very important book. She's the author of numerous books, including The Rise of Enlightened Sexism, The Mommy Myth, and Where the Girls Are, Growing Up Female with the Mass Media. She's lectured at colleges and universities around the country and has written for The Nation, In These Times, The Village Voice, Ms., The Washington Post. She served on the board of the George Foster Peabody Awards, and in 2010 was selected as chair of the board. And she is the 2009 recipient of the Leonardo da Vinci Prize, the highest honor given by the Society for the History of Technology to an individual who has greatly contributed to the history of technology through research, teaching, publications, and other activities. Susan, welcome, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Okay, that's fine. That's great.
Thank you, Jean. It is a real honor and pleasure to be at this wonderful event. It's also an honor and a pleasure to be at an event at Smith College that has produced so many outstanding women and feminist leaders and feminist icons. And from the looks of the audience, will continue to produce many more. The 1970s really saw the explosive rise of the women's movement. And as we know from the history of the women's movement, many women who became active in the feminist movement really emerged out of their work in the civil rights movement. And there were similarities and differences between the women's movement and the civil rights movement. But I want to point to one important difference. Civil rights activists who sat at lunch counters and who were trying to desegregate public facilities wanted to be seen and treated as citizens and as consumers. African Americans were virtually invisible on television, in general interest or women's magazines, in advertising, and activists understood that media visibility matters. Demanding rights matters, of course, but also being seen as consumers matters, because in this country, when you're a market, you matter. Now, for white women and girls, however, we had been a market, a huge one. But in the images that hailed us, we were represented in nearly totally stereotypical and denigrating ways as passive, dependent, weak, frivolous, glitzy, unintelligent, irrational, as sex objects and unable to clean the house without the help from the genie Mr. Clean. So there were elements of the women's movement that were in fact deeply anti-consumerist, because so much sold to us, cosmetics, curlers, bras, girdles, Mark Eden bust enhancing machines, and also how women were used as sex objects to sell cars, beer, shaving cream. All of these reinforced those stereotypes, and they were tools to keep us in our place. So now began issuing Barefoot and Pregnant awards for the most offensive advertising of that year. This activism about the negative images of women was what inspired feminist media studies to document feminist charges about the under or misrepresentation of women in the media. Much of this early work that we were able to teach when various of us were struggling around something that eventually came to be called feminist media studies, we had articles. Most of them were content analysis about what kind of roles women had on television, or what percentage of voiceovers were male or female, and the like. But those of us like me who began teaching about the images of women in the early 1980s, we had a few of these articles and we had a few book chapters, but we had nothing visual that really drove home the ubiquity, power, and impact of these images. We didn't have anything visual unless we made our own slides, which of course some pioneering people did, and some that targeted advertising. And we didn't have anything that really looked at advertising as the driver, the financial underpinning of all the media, and something that shrewdly recreated that sense of bombardment that women were exposed to every single day. We didn't have anything that showed how women's bodies were chopped up in ads and thus further dehumanized and objectified. We didn't have anything that drove home over and over how a corporately produced standard of beauty, slim, white, young, straight, that was absolutely impossible to achieve. One of my favorite Kilborn lines, which you saw here, I've always loved this line, about one of the models, is, "Even she doesn't look like that." Always loved that line. All of this policed women and made us feel bad about ourselves. We didn't have anything that emphasized how these representations were totally and utterly in the service of corporate America and consumer culture. And then we got Killing Us Softly. As we've heard from the videos and from Jean herself, she quickly began touring around the country to packed audiences who loved the message, loved her slideshow, and loved her. I know that whenever she came to Michigan, there was standing room only. She had to, as we've seen, constantly update it to add new ads and new points as the imagery has evolved, but her critique remained powerfully the same, and her shows and her talks and her lectures had the same powerful impact. She added other videos to her repertoire: Slim Hopes, which has been a favorite of my students, Deadly Persuasion, Spin the Bottle, Sex, Lies, and Alcohol, and others. I have witnessed firsthand the impact all of these videos have had on my students. And I think that her work, and as has been made clear in the presentations we've seen so far, has had enormous impact on criticisms of body shaming, and on the rise of body positivity. Jean's work has had a huge impact on that. It's had a huge impact on people's awareness of the connections between the representations of women and violence against women. And however far we have not come, her work has been so generative that, as has been pointed out before, Jean's not alone anymore. And I'm going to introduce you to 5 panelists whose work has been powerfully influenced by Jean's work and is living testimony to the generative nature of what Jean has done for all of us and for our culture and for critiques of the media. So what I am going to do, I'm going to go sit in the middle now, and I'm going to introduce the panelists in turn. Each panelist is going to have some words to say, and then we're going to open it up and kind of go back and forth with questions up here, and then we're going to open it up for comments and questions from the audience. Our first speaker is Elena Rossini. Elena is an Italian film director, producer, editor, and public speaker. Her most notable film, The Illusionists, a feature-length documentary about consumer culture and the marketing of unattainable beauty standards around the world, has been shown at dozens of schools, colleges, and universities, and in multiple corporate settings. She is the founder of No Country for Young Women, a website whose aim is to provide positive role models for young girls, and the creator of hashtag This Is What a Film Director Looks Like, a web-based project that posts GIFs of female and minority filmmakers in an effort to promote their visibility. The latter project has been written up in Mashable, the Huffington Post Australia, and A+. It was also recently featured by the New York Times Gender Initiative on their social media. She's currently producing The Realists, a documentary about technology and social media's impact on self-esteem and self-image. Please welcome Elena.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank MEF for organizing this fantastic event and Jean for inviting me to be a part of it. I hope you don't mind if I read from a statement, but if I could speak freely about how much I love Jean and her work, I could speak for 2 hours. So in the interest of being brief, I'm just going to read from my statement. I first came across Jean's work when I was a college student in Boston. It made a profound impression on me. At the time, I was a student in mass communication, and her film informed the way that I saw the field of advertising and the impact that advertising has on our society. And I think it's no coincidence that after watching Killing Us Softly, I decided not to pursue a career in advertising, but I went into filmmaking instead. And 10 years after first watching Killing Us Softly, I resolved to make a film about the globalization of beauty. And as soon as I made that decision, I knew that I wanted to interview Jean. And she was incredibly gracious. I mean, at that time, I'd only made a few short films, and I was completely unknown. But Jean really graciously agreed to be interviewed for my film, The Illusionist. And she gave such a phenomenal interview that she made my job really hard, because the entire 45 minutes that she spoke on film were so good that I wish I could have used the whole thing. What I'd also like you to know is that Jean is not only a courageous, brilliant advocate for women's issues, but she's also generous, incredibly kind, and a fierce ally of women. She has advised me for the years, and she has personally recommended The Illusionist to be shown at conferences and events where she's been invited to speak. And I can't begin to stress how rare and generous this is. So I'm forever indebted to Jean for that. There's a beautiful quote by the author, Christine Arillo, that I hold really close to my heart, and I think that it applies perfectly to Jean. The quote says, "When a woman has sisterhood with other women, without comparison or competition, she gains the superpower to soar." And I think that we can all agree that Jean has been soaring so high. And in my eyes, she's a real-life superhero and my ultimate role model. Growing up in Italy, I studied the classics. So I studied ancient Greek, Latin languages, and literature. And one of the most memorable and haunting stories was the myth of Cassandra. A figure in Greek mythology, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the story goes that the god Apollo fell in love with Cassandra, and gave her the power to predict the future. But when Cassandra rejected his advances, Apollo placed a curse on her. So she could warn people about future events, but nobody would believe her. And this myth stayed with me, especially the profound injustice of it, because I've observed time and time again how women's stories are often not heard or believed, or given the importance that they deserve. And there are so many real-life Cassandras that regrettably the public has not been paying attention to. But what makes me so hopeful about the future and so proud of Jean's work is that, unlike Cassandra, Jean has been successful in warning the public about toxic media messages and the dark side of advertising. She has fiercely advocated for books, films, lectures at schools and conferences all around the world, enlightening millions of people and making them aware of these problems. Now, we're here to celebrate Jean at Smith College, and I couldn't think of a better place to do so. Smith has educated so many of my feminist heroes, and on this day, I'm thinking especially of Betty Friedan. She wrote about the problem that has no name in The Feminine Mystique. And in her case, the problem that has no name was the idealized image of the American housewife that was marketed to women as the ultimate goal in life and the key to happiness. Now, similarly to Betty Friedan, Jean Kilburn has been a trailblazer, breaking the myths and illusions related to advertising and the idealized, unattainable images of women and girls that we see thousands of times a day, every day of our lives. Jean has made a big dent in our world, in my world too, forever changing how we see media and advertising, making us more empowered against this onslaught of toxic media messages. I am so glad that September 19th has been declared Advertising's Image of Women Awareness Day. And I want to thank Jean for her brilliant work in advocacy and for her friendship. Thank you, Jean.
Our next panelist is Jackson Katz. He is an internationally renowned for his pioneering scholarship and activism on issues of gender, race, and violence. He has been a major figure and thought leader in the growing global movement of men working to promote gender equality and prevent gender violence. He is the co-founder of Mentors in Violence Prevention, one of the longest running and most widely influential gender violence prevention programs in North America and beyond. He is the author of 2 books, including the classic bestseller, The Macho Paradox, Why Some Men Hurt Women and How All Men Can Help, that was recently released in a completely revised and updated edition, and Man Enough, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and the Politics of Presidential Masculinity. He is the creator of the award-winning Tough Guys, which I think many of you know, and the Tough Guys educational documentary series, and the recently released video, The Bystander Moment, Transforming Rape Culture at Its Roots. His TEDx talk, Violence Against Women is a Man's Issue, has over 4 million views. He has lectured and trained in all 50 states, 8 Canadian provinces, and every continent except Antarctica. Jackson.
Thank you very much, Susan. And let me say it's a great honor for me. I know it is for all of us, but to be part of this special event. Jean is such a critical force in our lives and in my life, and it's my honor, and thank you to Sut and the MEF folks, Kendra and others, for organizing this special event. And I appreciate it when I was listening to you speak, Jean, your comment about feeling like you were at your own memorial. This is great. I wish everybody had that opportunity. This is great, but you deserve it 100%. It's just fantastic what you've been able to do. Jean and I go way back. I knew Jean before Jean knew me, because I was a student at UMass, approximately 1980, and Jean came and did her slide lecture. And I remember being moved by it, and I, in fact, cut out the Collegian, the newspaper, the article about Jean's talk at UMass, and I still have it archived to this day, because obviously it made a big impression on me back then, because, you know, it did. And I remember thinking subsequently to that talk and the ideas that it sparked in my own mind, the template that she had created for looking critically at images of women would also apply to looking at images of men. And very few people had been doing that. Very, very few people had been doing that. And so one of the things that I ended up doing in my work was following in Jean's footsteps and developing critical analysis of the representations and narratives about masculinities in media, and especially connecting that to violence. And I know Jean, that's been a part of Jean's work. Jean's referenced this both in the film and in her comments earlier. When I started doing my work, the most central part of my work has been trying to engage men and the culture at large in addressing men's violence against women as a men's issue and getting men in positions of institutional and political power and cultural influence to address this global crisis, the ongoing crisis of men's violence against women. So in thinking about that problem, I had to think, okay, why do we have such a big problem? And obviously there's way more to it than we can say in this, than I can say in this very brief moment, but clearly the media culture and the narratives in media culture, including in advertising, help to shape norms, not just for women, but for men, and obviously across the gender and sexual identity spectrum. But again, very few people are looking at the images of men, and so I decided to do it. But basically every step of the way, I was basically borrowing and stealing from and learning from and adapting Jean's work to the point of literally making slide lectures with images of men and boys, and connecting those narratives and those images to issues in men's lives, especially the perpetration of violence and the glamorization and glorification of certain kinds of dominance represented through images and narratives. Several people, including Jean, have referenced the historical context of the beginning of Jean's work. I just want to give you one added piece of context. For those of us, well, for those people who are a little south of some of us in terms of age, tomorrow is the 46th anniversary of the Bobby Riggs versus Billie Jean King tennis match in the Houston Astrodome. And if you do any of the history, some of us were paying, I was a kid, but I was paying attention even back then. Jean was in that cultural milieu of back in the day when literally it was 90 million people worldwide watched this event where 55-year-old Bobby Riggs, a former Wimbledon champion, all bravado that he was going to beat Billie Jean King, who was the best women's tennis player in the world, and she beat him three straight sets. It was a big moment for sort of feminist activism and such. But anyways, the point is, that was the cultural milieu that produced Jean, but technologically, there was also a cultural sort of and historical context with regard to the technology. And again, Jean has referenced this, but I thought in coming here tonight that one thing that I wanted to introduce into the conversation was the actual artifact of the kind of work that Jean pioneered and that I followed in her footsteps with, which is, it was just way before PowerPoint, way before, I mean, personal computers didn't even, there was no such thing as personal computers. So we used to use, slide carousels, and Jean was the, pioneer of this, right? Some of us have, and this is a friend of mine, Rob Oken, this is Rob in the 80s, because I couldn't find mine in my archive, in my own basement. I have it buried somewhere, but this is our own, when our own stuff is like worthy of being in a museum, we know that it's time to pass it on to the next generation. But anyways, the point is, Jean was working with slides well before there was all the incredible technology, and it's a real pain in the ass to do a slideshow in the way that we used to do it. But Jean obviously was up to the task, and more so. And then I think finally, just for what it's worth, in terms of historical context, I put together a slide lecture in the early 90s, again, based on Jean's template, and it was on images of masculinities and violence in the media, and I called it My Gun's Bigger Than Yours, Images of Violence and Manhood in the Media. And by the way, Jean's sense of humor is an incredibly important part of her effectiveness as a public speaker. She's like a stand-up comic doing feminist media literacy, right? Which is so important, especially when you're dealing with really, really challenging subject matter. Loosening people up and making them laugh both at themselves and others is an important part of being an effective educator and communicator. Anyhow, My Gun's Bigger Than Yours was my slide lecture that I had developed in the early 90s. And then again, following in Jean's footsteps, I ended up working together with Tom Gardner and Sut and Jeremy Europe and making Tough Guys, which was basically a film version of the slide lecture that I had built based on Jean's Killing Us Softly series. And so I just came in Jean's wake, and I have to say my career and my sort of public visibility has been incredibly benefited from that. And I valued Jean being my mentor, but also a friend and colleague over these years. And Jean has been generous, not just to women, but also to men like myself, and been supportive from the beginning, and has been incredibly resourceful in that regard. And I really appreciate that. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Jennifer Posner. She's a media critic, media literacy educator, and the author of Reality Bites Back, The Troubling Truth About Guilty Pleasure TV, and the forthcoming graphic novel, Breaking the News, which will explore media literacy through a gender and racial justice lens. She was the founding director of Women in Media and News. Her work has been published in the New York Times, The Nation, Bitch, and multiple other outlets and anthologies. She's spoken about media at the intersections of gender, race, and class and sexuality at hundreds of schools all over the country, nonprofits, businesses, and conferences, as well as the United Nations, MoMA, and the Brooklyn Museum. And previously, she directed the Women's Desk at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, where she wrote for Extra, their magazine, and contributed to Counterspin Radio, and was a Media Watch columnist for Sojourner, the Women's Forum. In addition, Jennifer has served as an advisor and feature commentator for numerous documentaries, including the award-winning film Misrepresentation, and has delivered media commentary on multiple news outlets, including CBS, ABC, MSNBC, and Comedy Central. Jennifer.
Thanks, Susan, and thank you, Sut and the Media Education Foundation for putting on this event. As you just heard, I speak a lot at a lot of different places, but it is a rare honor. I haven't been as excited to come to do any panel in years because Jean Kilbourne means so much to me. I'm not going to speak about Jean in third person. I'm just going to speak to Jean. Jean, I regularly, I don't know if I've told you this, but I regularly tell anybody who'll ask and people who don't ask that you are absolutely foundational in my development as a media critic and as a media literacy educator. I don't know that I would have become a media literacy educator without your work. And more importantly, maybe even without, I'm going to echo the theme so far, without your generosity. When I was a journalism student at Hampshire College, just down the road in the early 90s, my first year of school, I thought I was just going to do traditional column journalism, opinion journalism, and then I started to realize a lot of the misogyny that ran through corporate media, both content and behind the scenes in the industry, and I decided that I would become a media critic. And then I saw Jean Kilbourne's work, I saw your film, and realized that it wasn't just news media, it was all throughout the industry. It was pop culture as well, it was advertising. when I eventually started working at FAIR, at the time when I graduated from Hampshire, it was '96. There was still very little out there. Everybody right now, you know, it's such a different world, as we're saying. There's everybody kind of thinks they're a media critic now because they've watched a TV show once and talked about it on Twitter, you know. But it's a real discipline, right? And Jean has built a field, as you've heard. There would not be feminist media studies without Jean and her work. But back when I was working at FAIR, FAIR was the only Media Watch organization that focused on news in the whole country. And there was maybe 7 people on staff. I was running the women's desk there, so I was the only person in the country with that job. And I was 24. And Jean, we had already been in touch, I don't remember how, probably at conferences or something, probably because I'd fangirled over you. And at one point, you had been asked by the Boston Globe to write an article as if you were an editor for a day of the Boston Globe. And I remember you called me, again, 24 or 25 at FAIR, and you asked me what I thought you should put in that article. And that was, up until that point, running the women's desk at FAIR was my dream job, but there was not a moment before then that had ever been as big as you asking me for my advice. But this is another element of Jean's generosity. It is very rare for somebody who is an icon to think that anybody can tell them anything. Not to mention that somebody half their age might have something worthy of some advice or some. Jean was always ready to treat me like a colleague, and that helped me gain a level of confidence I didn't even know I didn't have until you reinforced that. So when I left FAIR and I founded Women in Media and News, part of the way I wanted to build that organization was with the same understanding that we don't have to live in a culture of scarcity within the social justice movement, that we can be encompassing, that we can mentor each other, that we can be allies to one another, that we don't have to be threatened in the way we work together. And then that's how Jamia and I have worked together in the last 10, 20, 12 years or so. I also remember a moment. Do you remember when you and I watched the Mel Gibson film in theaters, What Women Want, together? Because Jean had just come out with her book, Can't Buy My Love, How Advertising Changes the Way We Think and Feel. It is still brilliant. You should read it. And I had pitched an article to, I think it was Salon at the time, and they said, oh, that's great. And I said, you know what would be a great hook? Why don't we go to this film that's all about advertising and misogyny and watch it together? That was another moment that I remember thinking was this sort of transformational moment for me, where, you know, if there's ever a moment in your life where you're thinking, I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, like I wonder if I'm really good at my job. Picture yourself, you're in a theater, a movie theater, the lights are down, you and one of your idols is sitting next to you, and you both have notepads. And as the movie is going on, every particular sexist thing that happens, you're both scribbling notes, but you start to realize that you're scribbling notes. You're noticing the same things that Jean is noticing, and all of a sudden I realized, yeah, I guess we are colleagues now. Like, this is okay. And I'll also say that when I wrote my book, Reality Bites Back, I didn't want to write a book. I didn't want to be the first person to take on a genre that was incredibly toxic. I kept waiting for this book to be written. I kept waiting for somebody to do a Jean Kilbourne style, Susan Faludi style, a sort of mashup between Jean and Susan, take on a genre that was representing women and representing people of color as if the 60s and 70s had never happened. I kept waiting for somebody like a Jeff Cohen or a Jeanine Jackson from FAIR to take on the media economics aspect of how this genre was proliferating, and it just wasn't happening. So I finally wrote this book, and your work is foundational again to my analysis of reality TV throughout this book. When you look at how product placement is embedded throughout the genre of reality television, when you look at how women's suffering is celebrated and mocked as if it is the point, when you look at people of color being treated in very minstrel-like images, all of the analysis I was able to bring to that, I learned from you. So again, like Elena said, I could talk for hours, and so I'm just gonna stop, but I'm gonna say thank you. The one last thing I'll say is when I started to do lectures, Jean, again, as she was generous to Elena, as she was generous to Jackson, was also generous to me. When she would have too many bookings and couldn't speak, she would tell colleges, oh, you know, I have the person you should bring instead. And I would often go to schools with the immense, intimidating honor of doing a media literacy presentation when knowing that they had wanted Jean. And it was always such an amazing feeling when an audience member would say, oh, you know, this kind of reminds me of, do you know that media critic Jean Kilbourne? I said, yes, I did something right.
Our next panelist is Jamia Wilson. She's an activist, a feminist leader, writer, and speaker. As director of the Feminist Press at the City University of New York and the former VP of Programs at the Women's Media Center, Jamia has been a leading voice on women's rights issues for over a decade. Her work has appeared in numerous outlets, including the New York Times, the Today Show, CNN, Elle, BBC, Rookie, Refinery 29, Glamour, and the Washington Post. She's the author of Young, Gifted, and Black, The Introduction and Oral History in Together We Rise, Behind the Scenes at the Protest Heard Around the World, and Step Into Your Power, 23 Lessons on How to Live Your Best Life. Jamia.
So much. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here today, and I'm just deeply honored to be here to celebrate 40 years of Killing Us Softly, but also celebrating the vision and courage that you had, Jean, to understand something that needed to be addressed in the world and transformed and taking it on, even when the world hadn't caught up to you yet. I think that the people that I look up to the most throughout history are those people, women, who have had the courage to speak out early with the vision before the rest of the world catches up to you and then takes credit for the ideas that you had then. And so when I was thinking about what makes you so great, I think about the fact that I have been privileged enough to have grown up in a society that had your teaching in it throughout the trajectory of my life. I will be 40 in 2020, so I'm not just there yet. But I think that having been in a world that Jean Kilbourne was in and the work that you're creating reverberated into the culture in a way that affects a young feminist upbringing with scholarly parents who also highly curated what I was just experiencing, probably like a lot of the people who were in this room. But I think it's important. I think of the fact that although now I am the first director of the Feminist Press to be a woman of color and the youngest in our 50-year history, that thank you. Thank you. I feel that being a part of the story of the longest running feminist publishing house in the world is part and parcel of being someone who had 50 years of feminist publishing. The Feminist Press existed in my lifetime. My mother had those books on her shelf. I stole some of those books from her shelf and still have them, and now I'm having the privilege of being able to reissue some of them. And so I want to just also talk about what it means to be a good ancestor while you're here, to plant the seeds for other generations to take this world on, and to put our imprint into the lineage that you've already created, and to be in conversation with you. I think that's so important, and I'm really honored to be a part of that Gloria Steinem is someone who's also very much deeply influenced me, a Smithy, very proud Smithy I've seen in the work I've done with her. And she has said that you get mad on your own behalf. And that when I came to her kind of saying, oh, I'm having some intergenerational arguments with older feminists who disagree with the way that I'm looking at this thing or that thing, this was years ago, or just infighting I'm having with other Black feminists on Twitter right now about what we're disagreeing about, or infighting I'm having with other feminists my age on Twitter, what should I do? And kind of getting her chuckle, saying, oh, this has always kind of been here. And a part of it is that we do kind of get mad on our own behalf, that there were people from the suffrage times who were telling her that that was what she should be focusing on. But what was right in front of her then was about reproductive justice, not being able to own property without judgment in New York City as a working writer because she was a woman, not being able to get a credit card in her own name as an unmarried woman. And so I have thought a lot about you getting mad on your own behalf. And what happens when a woman gets mad on her own behalf, it's the reason I'm a feminist is because that means then the actions that we will have will reverberate for the rest of the world, and that's why we saw at the Women's March, the largest protest in recorded history, what happens when women get mad. And so I'm just really wanting to say that what you've taught me is to be able to acknowledge those things that we instinctually know are not right and are not righteous, and to be able to apply our expertise and learning to putting those things into practice in a better way, and naming things that need to be changed in the world. But then also to see what I'm mad about on my own behalf because of my subjectivity as a Black woman who was raised outside of this country for most of my life with a global perspective, who has a disability that I was born with, that those things have given me tools to see this world with the analysis that I've learned from you and many others, with my own specific take that the world also needs. And so I thought about you with some of the covers that we've made for our books. And maybe I'll think, I was taught, what would Jesus do? What would Jean Kilbourne do? I'm looking at this cover right now and I'm thinking about Virgie Tovar's book, where one of you came to mind, and she was doing this amazing manifesta about really taking the body positivity movement even into task to say, what would it mean to actually say you have the right to remain fat? And to say that the diet industry and the wellness industry really needs to be interrogated and disrupted, and that she, as a fat woman of color, was going to do that on her own terms. And so I thought of you in it and thought, what are we gonna do about this cover? Because we know covers are so problematic, even when people try to be woke. In many different cases, we see this. And so we were going along on Virgie's Instagram, and I thought, what would it be like if we just used a picture she took of herself, and to show that with this manifesta that we are also saying that her own image, her own power is also powerful for others. And so she's on the cover in a bikini, looking amazing, on the cover of You Have the Right to Remain Fat. And it's one of the covers I'm most proud of at Feminist Press, because I think about how much that disrupts what we receive in the advertising industry and what we also have as a powerful media creators, so that we don't have to just consume and absorb this. We're being handed a shit sandwich. We don't have to eat it. Marie Forleo always says that, and I've thought a lot about that in terms of what I can do from my perspective, and that's what I can do. What kind of cover does the world need? The cover needs fat, brown bodies centered in their full dignity and humanity. So I want to thank you for that, and I also want to thank you for also just allowing me and others who have benefited from your work to have that healthy experience in a toxic culture of feeling seen and knowing that nothing's wrong with us, but it's the system that's broken. For the longest time, I thought something was wrong with my armpits. I really did. I thought that I had the world's ugliest armpits, because whenever I would see women in magazines, are there other people in this room who felt that way about their armpits? That I never saw any stubble. There was no discoloration or pigmentation that was off, or these sorts of things, and especially with women of color's bodies. And it wasn't until I watched Killing Me Softly in an auditorium in high school that I thought, oh, those armpits are airbrushed. I hate to admit this, but I was bleaching my armpits and scalding myself, thinking that that's what I had to do to be not just even beautiful, but to be acceptable if I was going to play sports or if I was going to be taking pictures or be seen. And so I also just think, aside from the important work that you're doing around representation, you're also just helping to create a healthier world, because the violence that you're talking about is also violence that we can inflict upon ourselves, because the world tells us that we don't have a right to be in it unless we conform to these standards. So thank you so much.
Our next panelist is Byron Hurt, an award-winning documentary filmmaker, published writer, activist, and lecturer. He played quarterback on Northeastern University's football team and is a founding member of the Mentors in Violence Prevention Program, the leading college-based rape and domestic violence prevention initiative for college and professional athletes. He also served as associate director of the first gender violence prevention program in the U.S. Marine Corps. His film credits include I Am a Man, Black Masculinity in America, Hip Hop, Beyond Beats and Rhymes, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was later broadcast on the PBS series Independent Lens, and Soul Food Junkies, which won the CNN Best Documentary Award at the American Black Film Festival and Best Documentary at the Urban World Film Festival in New York City. Soul Food Junkies also broadcast on Independent Lens and the cable network TV1. He is currently in post-production for his current film project, Hazing. Byron is an adjunct professor in the School of Journalism at Columbia in their documentary program, and recently served as a filmmaker in residence at American University. He's currently a consultant for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Forward Promise Initiative, a storytelling project for boys and young men of color. Byron?
Thank you. Thank you. So, Jean, when you released Killing Us Softly in 1979, I was 10 years old, 10. And when I was 10, I really, really loved sports, football, basketball, baseball. I was a really typical boy in that regard. And I also really, really loved when my father would ask my sister and I to walk down to the store on Sunday morning and pick up the Sunday newspaper and Jet magazine. You know why I was so happy and how much I loved, or why I loved to pick up Jet magazine? Anybody have any idea? Because in Jet magazine, every week they would release a new Jet Beauty of the Week. And it would be an African American woman who I now know and understand had or fit European standards of beauty generally, were women who were, generally speaking, but not always, lighter skinned, and whose measurements were always posted, right? Their measurements were always posted. And as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old, a young boy growing up, I never questioned the Jet Beauty of the Week. And I was like many boys and men who look forward to objectifying women because we saw it as normal, we saw it as a birthright, we saw it as the way things were supposed to be without question. And as a young boy growing up, the son of two parents who came out of the South, who grew up and experienced living through Jim Crow, I heard many, many stories about how race impacted them, but I didn't really hear a whole lot of stories about how gender impacted both my father and my mother. It wasn't until I graduated from college that I really seriously began to question gender. In college, I took a class called Blacks in the Media and the Press. It was taught by a professor named Elizabeth Hadley Freiberg. And that was my first media literacy course. But it focused mainly on racial stereotypes, not so much gender stereotypes. And so I was politicized in terms of my racial understanding, right? Like I understood how race impacted me as an African American man, right? And I understood that race was a big issue, but only as it affected boys and men like me. I didn't really pay close attention, if I paid any attention at all, to the ways in which racism impacted girls and women of color, and how patriarchy impacted girls and women of color. And so when I graduated from Northeastern University and became the first former athlete hired by Jackson Katz for the Mentors in Violence Prevention program, I spent many, many days and countless hours driving up and down the East Coast in New England, having conversations with Jackson about gender and its impact on boys and men. And I can't tell you how many times your name came up in conversations about the work that you did and your slideshow and your film, how they impacted Jackson and how it impacted his work and how it led to the creation of his slideshow that he mentioned. But those conversations were the foundation for my gender awareness, my gender consciousness. And it is women like you who helped me to grow and to evolve into the man that I am now. When I was 10 years old, I didn't even know what a feminist was. And if I did know, if I heard anything about feminism, it was something to be avoided, and it was something that should strike fear in boys and men, right? Not something that we should be allying, not people who we should be allying with. So your work has been critical in my development as a young man, right? So watching your film and deconstructing the ways in which women have been objectified through media and advertising, whether it's print or magazines or whatever, it really helped to develop my own consciousness, and I want to thank you for that. I became so familiar with your work and the work by other feminist writers and critical thinkers like Bell Hooks and Patricia Hill Collins and Andrea Dworkin and other women who I would have never read or studied had it not been for your work and the work of other feminists who paved the way for those women. So I thank you for that as well. And I think it's really important for you and for everyone to understand and know that boys and men can also be deeply impacted by the critical analysis that you laid the foundation to challenging. And it's important for boys and men to be challenged in the way that we internalize all of these images and representations that we are fed from the time that we are young boys, and how it impacts our relationships with girls and women in our lives, whether they're family members or whether they are women that we are, girls and women that we are in relationship with. And so your work is vital, it's critical, as everyone has stated. But for boys and men, it is even more critical because we need to be challenged. We need to be made more aware of how these images impact us. And so today, I think my daughter just walked out of the room. She's missing her moment here. I may have to save this, maybe she'll walk back in. But it was important. I had my daughter watch Killing Us Softly, the original one, and also Killing Us Softly 4 as we took the train up today to be a part of this event. And I was really amazed at how engaged she was. She's 10 years old herself. And I was amazed at how engaged she was, how much she got it, and how much she was disturbed by what it was that she was watching and engaging with. But it was important for me to show her that work because I want her to be much more politically engaged and much more activated than I was at her age. And so I just want you to know that your impact, your work continues to have an impact on someone like my daughter who is 10 years old, which means that your work is timeless, it's classic, it's relevant, and it still matters. So thank you so much, and it's my honor to be here with you. And I'm so grateful to be an invited speaker. Thank you so much.
I had a bunch of questions for people, but they've answered a lot of them already. And so I thought I'd just throw out one question for the panel and then open it up for comments or questions from the audience. Oh, we have cards coming from the audience. Okay. So the one question I would ask, and I'd begin by saying, you know, what we've seen here is a kind of a historical arc where there's Jean with her slide carousel, and then it becomes a movie and a video, and her influence spreads because she gives so many talks around the country, but as is evidenced by the panel right here and way beyond this panel, she has had a generative effect on the circulation of media literacy, media activism, feminist media activism by men and women. And so that's the good news, right? That's the great news. But I want to ask us about this moment. So on the one hand, with the Women's March, with the Me Too movement, there has been a dramatic resurgence of feminism, an expansion of feminism to become more intersectional. There's been much more feminist activism online and in social media, and much of it geared towards media criticism. There's been the rise of Black Lives Matter and massive awareness of and criticism about structural racism, and that's very, very important. And on the other hand, we have had the rise of some of the most toxic hatred and racism and misogyny online and elsewhere. And so I wanted to ask, you all are hardworking, positive thinking despite everything media activists and media literacy people. How do you see things now? What are your hopes? What are your fears about what we and others can do about the media at this moment when there's such a collision between progressive and regressive forces?
So one thing I want to say that I feel that Jen, who was a student of Jean Kilbourne, so I love how the trajectory comes here, predicted Donald Trump's presidency. So you all need to read her book. Need to read Reality Bites Back. But she looked at what was happening in The Apprentice and was able to show through this very in-depth analysis in her intersectional book about the perils of reality TV at that time. She predicted that that cult of personality, the uplifting of the buffoonery that we now have to endure on Twitter bombastically every day, that all of that was going to happen if we continued to let that toxicity permeate into our culture and become normalized and codified into how we exist. And so when I think about that, and I think about the fact that you did predict this, and many other people were also starting to get much more into how to talk about intersectional media advocacy and to uplift it during a time when there was not a lot of funding for it, and there still isn't, right? So I think about one easy thing we could do is, what would happen if we actually invested in culture work in a really intentional way, and we invested in it like certain other countries do, not this one, and really put our money into just the way we would support candidates, which I think is also important, and the way we would support other direct service charities that we also care about, to support cultural production that creates counter speech to the toxic media that we are all battling against, because that toxic media is very much responsible for what we are seeing now as it relates to all the systemic ills we've discussed. Many of the people who were at the helm of making Charlottesville the terrible, racist, terrorist event that it was, were people who had already been documented by many feminists and others who were watching for being online harassers and trolls and also domestic abusers who had started with violence against women in their trajectory. So for me, I think one of the most important things we can do is invest in supporting really, really deep analysis, investigative journalism, and support for feminist media analysis and critique, as well as the organizations that are documenting this work. And also, if we don't have dollars to invest, to make sure we're spreading the word with social media, doing the appropriate things to protect your identity, of course, that's my disclaimer, and all of those things. And also making sure that we are standing with and up for the people who are doing this work. I think now the work that is happening is becoming more dangerous for people who are speaking truth to power, and online harassment is really terrible. A lot of us have been doing work trying to work with platforms to create policies that will make it less dangerous for us to do this work, but it's also important for us to just stand up with the people who are doing this work and to support us, because the Cassandra syndrome is here, and it's something that we are dealing with a lot in a gaslight culture, where I've literally had people tell me that I'm a part of a white feminist conspiracy. Is something that I've had told to me by people in my own community who are voting and engaging in things that are against their own interest because of #fake news. So I think that those are things that we can really do, is to promote integrity in media, support in whatever ways that we are capable, counter speech and cultural change work, but also really in community and also in practice, being there to support the people who are uplifting their voices, because we're in a time right now where the backlash is a sign of the progress we're making. And I think it's because there's this very loud last gasp of the people who know that if they don't try to pull back now, the work that has been built over the last 50 years will transform culture enough that they won't be able to stop it. And so to me, I think it's really important that when we see people being attacked online, when we see people being maligned in the media, when we see people being undermined and standing alone, that we do whatever we can to uplift them, and instead of kind of hiding away and hoping it won't happen to us, really taking a stand with and for each other.
I think that to carry on a lot of what you're saying, I obviously echo all of that. I'd also say that it's really important to fight back with really applying critical thinking to every piece of media we engage with every single day, because one of the most important things of the many that Jean has taught us is that we all think we are not affected by media, that other people are, but that we're so smart, we're educated, we're savvy, but right now it's not just advertising, it's not just movies, it's not just deep fakes that are out there sort of corrupting our understanding of what is real and what isn't. It's also, presidential policy by tweet. It's also, right now we have a moment in which journalism and the idea of the free press, journalism being the only industry in this whole country that has constitutional protection, and yet that very idea is under attack. As a journalist, I'm called an enemy of the people, right? We have a fake, before Donald Trump co-opted the term, fake news meant manipulative, inaccurate propaganda distributed to either sell a product or sell an idea. Now what people think of as fake news is anything unflattering to a politician like Trump or anything that you don't particularly agree with. And that is fundamentally counter to the very idea of truth, of facts. We have the idea of alternative facts out there. So we need to constantly be speaking about this, be thinking about this, be talking about this. I would very strongly encourage media literacy workshops. If media literacy is not taught at your local junior high school, try to talk to your city council, try to talk to your school boards, and try to get media literacy programs either taught consistently or bring in experts like Jean or Jackson or Elena or me or Jamia or Byron or Susan to come in and do some workshops with students, junior high, high school, college. I'm happy to come back to Smith and do one for 4 hours or 4 days. But we need to be really methodical in the way that we break down what we're hearing from advertising and also from news and also from politicians. The thing that does give me hope, though, is like Jean said in Killing Us Softly 4, she's not alone anymore, right? I'm not either. When I started Women in Media and News, it was because there wasn't any national feminist media organization that did media trainings, but also media analysis, but also worked with journalists to increase representation of women in front of and behind the camera as news sources, as artists and creators of entertainment. Now, there are tons of media literacy and media activist organizations that have both feminist and racial justice as part of their unifying vision and model of change. I have sisters in struggle like Jamia. There are organizations like Magnet, the Media Action Grassroots Network. There are organizations like Spark and Real Girls in Seattle. There are Color Lines, Color Lines that used to be print magazine, now online. Bitch Media, which used to be just a print magazine, is still in print and needs your support. Supporting independent media is important. But they also have now podcasts and a robust multimedia platform. There are independent media outlets left and right that you can find that are really providing a counter to the negativity, to the hate, to the inaccuracy out there. And also, there's culture jamming. There are activists putting out fake versions of the New York Times that sort of critique all of the inaccuracy and all of the violence. Even culture, just today I saw an ad on New York's, that was culture jammed on the New York City subway that looks like the ads from the MTA that try to get you to snitch on people who jump the fares. Instead, culture jammers put up an ad that mimicked the template of it, but talked about why people might actually, whether it's poverty or a health concern or whatever it is, they might jump the fare for a legit reason. Just swipe them in, don't call the cops. And that's now all over the subway, looking like a legit ad. You can do that too. So the last thing I want to say is creating your own media is the next step. Media literacy is a two-part project. First, it's becoming aware and becoming critical thinker. Then it's about how to create media yourself if you want to do that, whether it's a small thing like your own stories on Instagram, or it can be a big thing like creating your own videos on YouTube that become like Issa Rae did with Misadventures of Awkward Black Girl, eventually became her own series on HBO. So there are many, many options.
Thank you. Yep. Yeah, we have to be mindful. We appreciate people have a long day, and this is a great event, but I'll try to be mindful as well. I'll talk really fast. One thing is, my doctoral dissertation was about critical political media literacy, And my argument, which is hardly been taken up, is that if we want to educate thoughtful citizens in a democratic society in an age, and Sutton says this all the time, that the media image and the visual image is the driving narrative force of our time, to think that we're going to educate students with the traditional civics classes is naive. That's 20th century, and we're in the 21st century, and we have to integrate critical political media literacy into civics education, which we need a big boost in. And that has to happen at the legislative level and at the policy level. I appreciate Jen's comments about culture jamming and such, but I think if we're talking about structural problems, we have to have structural solutions, which means we have to have political support, and we need to have educational reform at all levels. That's one thing. The other thing is the sort of the big elephant in the house. I happen to be the one white man in the panel, I think. Although I'm Jewish, so I'm not quite white, according to the racial typologies of the day and Germany in the 30s. But I think we have to talk about the white male backlash, not just the white backlash. I think a big part of what's happening in the United States and in Europe is not just white resistance to ethnic and racial integration and immigration. That's obviously part of it. We have to talk about the fact that men are threatened by the rise of women, and white men in particular are organizing, and in individual and idiosyncratic ways, as well as in organized ways, are fighting back against the loss of men's power and white men's centrality. And I believe Jamia made this point, and we all talk about this as well, that feminists have been at the forefront of linking the private sphere of the family to the public, making all kinds of insights about the relationship between the private sphere and the public sphere. One of them is that a huge number of the young men and young white men who have committed these mass shootings are also domestic violence perpetrators and domestic violence victims, and they're playing out their own personal sagas and tragedies and hurting lots of other people in the process. Feminists have been saying this for decades. We need so much feminist leadership in this moment. It's obvious to many of us. The way in which so many young white men are being politicized through media is not through advertising, it's through YouTube. Although there's YouTube advertising, it's not one or the other. And podcasts, and so much of the anti-feminist fervor that's being whipped up among millions of young white men by Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and these other right-wing ideologues who have huge audiences of young white men. That's another form of 21st century media that Jen has written about and others of us have talked about. We need to be thinking, when we think about media, and Jean's work obviously centers the image, the visual image and advertising. And now in the 21st century, we have all these other forms of media that have to be critically examined. And finally, the point that I didn't make in my earlier talk was how much feminist ideas, including Jean's, archetypally, have influenced positive changes in men's lives. Byron was really powerful in his own personal narrative about that. Feminist ideas have not just changed women's lives, they've changed men's lives. And the ways in which we're looking critically at narratives about men and media representations of men, or the health, all the health issues that so many men have in their lives, the women's health movement, and I would say Jean's work is clearly part of the feminist-led women's health movement, whether it's substance abuse or narratives about eating disorders and all kinds of other things. The feminist-led women's health movement has been the precursor to the men's health movement. So all the positive things that have been happening in men's health, thinking about men's depression and men's physical and sexual and emotional health, so many of the positive things that are happening around the culture and around the world are indebted to feminist leadership. And that needs to be said, and we need to shout that loudly, because so many men see feminism, because they listen to the people like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, see feminism as the enemy of men, when in fact feminism is the best thing that's ever happened to men.
Can I say something very briefly? Very briefly?
Yes.
It should not be okay that we have a president of the United States who routinely and openly dehumanizes women of color in this country, congresswomen in this country, and other women in this country who challenge his patriarchy, and who challenge his power, and who challenge his policies. And I think that we have to stand up collectively to push back against the administration and a media structure that allows it to happen. And so I just want to say that really quickly, that everyone in this room, including everyone on this panel, should speak strongly and powerfully about the level of dehumanization that is taking place in this country right now with women of color in general, but also women leaders in this country who challenge his power.
So unfortunately, we only have time for one audience question. So we've chosen one for Jean, and she's going to read it and answer it.
Okay, so, and I'm sorry we don't have time for the other questions, and it would be wonderful to hear from everybody so much longer and to hear from all of you as well, but we're mindful of the time. So the question I got was, what would you add or update in a fifth movie? And I mean, certainly, I would add a whole lot about social media and about the ways in which people are getting their advertising these days, which is mostly online rather than, so that would be one big thing that I would do. And there are many of other things too, but I did get one other question I can answer in like one word. How did you deal with self-doubt and a lack of self-confidence when you were younger, budding activist just starting out? Years of therapy. And really good friendships and support with other women from the very beginning, so that was just incredibly important. So now we're going to turn it over to Sun.
Today has been declared by the mayor of Northampton as Advertising's Image of Women Awareness Day, so September 19th, 2019. Let me just read you all the whereases of what this resolution is. So whereas the Northampton-based Media Education Foundation is celebrating the 40th anniversary of Jean Kilbourne's pioneering film, Killing Us Softly, with an event and panel discussion at Smith College on September 19th, 2019. We're here. Whereas the Media Education Foundation was founded by Northampton resident and UMass professor Sajali to foster a more media-savvy citizenry by providing, in accessible video format, the observations of leading scholars on media and society. Whereas Jean Kilbourne, National Women's Hall of Fame inductee and internationally renowned media scholar and feminist activist, has been one of MEF's central scholars. Whereas negative media representations of women contribute to gender inequality. Whereas challenging media representations of gender, as Jean Kilbourne does, makes the world safer for more and far more accessible to women. And whereas the city of Northampton takes pride in being the home of the Media Education Foundation, which has supplied thousands of teachers across the country and abroad with critical tools for helping millions of their students think more critically about the media they consume. And whereas the city of Northampton is proud to be the birthplace of Killing Us Softly 3 and Killing Us Softly 4, which are the updated, and revised versions of the original documentary. Almost there. Now, therefore, I, David Narkowitz, Mayor, do hereby proclaim and designate September 19th, 2019 as Advertising's Image of Women Awareness Day. And the City of Northampton urges all citizens to join me in recognizing and celebrating the contributions of Jean Kilbourne and the Media Education Foundation to Northampton and the wider community. I believe we have a special presentation from to mark this to Jean.
And that's oh wow.
This is for your extraordinary contribution.
Oh, sorry.
Honoring 40 years.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you all on this panel. You were just fabulous. We'll remember this forever. This really is better than being at my own memorial service. Much better, actually, because I'm alive. Thank you so much. And now, Sut just asked me, now will you make Killing Us Softly 5? We'll see.